He faced many challenges during his time in the military, but he couldn't have prepared for the tiny German shepherd that followed him everywhere. The puppy followed his every move and gesture without fail. Initially, he thought it was just a lost puppy, until the puppy began to bring him unexpected things that could melt even the hardest heart. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more. The forest lay silent beneath fresh snow, its breath held in pale winter light, where cold pressed against wood and bone alike, and every sound felt like a trespass into something ancient and watching. Ethan Walker had chosen this place because it did not ask questions. His cabin sat near the forest's edge, rough-cut timber darkened by years of frost and wind, smoke rising faintly from a stone chimney that never burned too hot. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet density of a man shaped by discipline rather than comfort. Broad shoulders sloped slightly forward, not from weakness, but from habit, like someone used to carrying weight that never truly left his back. His jaw was angular, shadowed by a trimmed beard flecked with early gray, and his eyes, steel-colored and always alert, rarely rested. People used to describe him as intimidating before they learned he spoke softly, avoided crowds, and preferred animals to conversation. The years he spent as a Navy SEAL had sharpened him, but the mission that ended his service, one extraction gone wrong, one teammate lost beneath collapsing ice, had hollowed something inside him that never fully returned. That morning, Ethan stepped out into knee-deep snow, pulling his coat tighter as the cold bit through layers like it had teeth. He wore the same habits every day: slow breath, steady pace, eyes scanning without conscious thought. The storm that had raged through the night had finally passed, leaving the forest reshaped, branches bowed under white weight, old tracks erased, silence restored. He moved toward a line of rusted animal traps left behind years earlier by hunters who no longer came this far north. Ethan checked them not to hunt, but to make sure nothing living had wandered into steel, meant to be forgotten. It was a pointless routine, he knew, but routine kept the mind from wandering into places it didn't survive well. He noticed the movement only because it didn't belong. Between the dark trunks of the pines, something small shifted against the snow, unsteady, hesitant. Ethan froze instantly, muscles tightening, instincts rising before thought. At first he assumed it was a fox or a rabbit disturbed by the storm. Then the shape stepped forward, and his breath caught. A German shepherd puppy stood there, no more than 3 months old, its legs too long for its body, fur thick but matted with ice and clumps of snow. Black and tan markings blurred beneath dirt, one ear half folded while the other tried and failed to stand. Its ribs showed faintly beneath its coat, and its paws trembled, not just from cold, but from exhaustion. The puppy didn't bark. It didn't run. It simply stared at Ethan with wide, dark eyes that reflected fear and something deeper, expectation. Ethan straightened slowly, careful not to startle it. Lost animals were common near highways, but not here, not this deep, not in winter. "Hey," he murmured, voice low and even, the same tone he used once to calm terrified civilians in war zones. The puppy flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, it took one tentative step forward, then stopped, as if unsure whether it was allowed to exist in this space. Ethan noticed a strip of cloth tied loosely around its neck, frayed and stiff with frozen moisture, as if torn from a sleeve or scarf. No collar, no tag. Whoever this dog belonged to hadn't planned to lose it, or had never planned to keep it safe at all. Ethan turned away, testing a theory. He took several steps back toward the cabin, boots crunching softly through the snow. Behind him there was a sound, small, uneven, urgent. He glanced over his shoulder. The puppy followed, clumsy and determined, stopping whenever he stopped, starting again the moment he moved. Its tail hung low, not wagging, not tucked completely, suspended in a nervous middle ground. This wasn't curiosity. This was attachment forming too fast, too desperately. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same warning signal he'd learned to trust long before things went wrong. He changed direction, angling toward the tree line, increasing his pace. The puppy struggled to keep up, slipping once, scrambling back to its feet, breath puffing white into the air. Ethan slowed instinctively, irritation mixing with concern. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, more to himself than the animal. The puppy answered with a faint sound, not a bark, but a broken whine, thin and hoarse, as if it had cried too much already. When Ethan stopped again, the puppy closed the distance between them, lowering its head and gently catching the edge of his pant leg between small teeth. It didn't pull hard. It didn't tug playfully. It held on, trembling, then released and took a few steps in the opposite direction, glancing back at him. That was when Ethan knew, not because of logic, but because of memory. He had seen this before, soldiers guiding medics through smoke, civilians pulling strangers toward rubble where voices were trapped underneath. The look was the same, not panic, purpose, fighting fear. Ethan exhaled slowly, scanning the forest. The wind carried nothing but cold and pine. No voices, no engines, just the puppy, waiting. "All right," he said quietly. "Show me." The word felt heavier than it should have, like a promise he wasn't sure he was ready to keep. The puppy moved ahead, not running but trotting in short bursts, stopping every few yards to make sure Ethan followed. They stayed near a narrow trail, barely visible beneath snow, the kind used by park rangers and wildlife officials, not tourists. Ethan recognized it immediately. Someone inexperienced could survive on this path. Someone injured might crawl along it before collapsing. His pulse quickened, senses sharpening as old training slid into place. He noticed disturbed snow. Branches snapped low, footprints that didn't align properly, suggesting weight dragged rather than carried. The puppy slowed, its body lowering, ears flattening. It let out another small sound, almost a plea. Ethan crouched briefly, resting a gloved hand against the cold ground. There were faint stains beneath the snow, darker where warmth had melted it briefly before freezing again. Blood. Not much, but enough. His jaw tightened, a familiar anger rising, sharp and controlled. He looked at the puppy again, really looked this time, not as an inconvenience, but as a witness. "You didn't run," he said softly. "You stayed." The puppy responded by pressing closer to his leg, its body shaking harder now, the weight of what it carried finally threatening to overwhelm it. They stopped near a fallen pine, its roots clawing at the air like frozen veins. The puppy refused to go closer, pacing, circling, whining. Ethan scanned the area, every muscle coiled, every sense open. He hadn't seen a person yet. He hadn't found anyone. But the forest felt different here, thicker, heavier, as if it remembered something it didn't want to give back easily. Ethan rose slowly, breath steady despite the cold, and took one step forward, then another, following the direction the puppy indicated. Whatever waited ahead, it had already changed the course of his morning, and perhaps something far deeper than that. Ethan turned back toward the cabin as the forest exhaled around him, the snow creaking faintly beneath his boots. And for a brief moment he told himself that this was all it was. A strange encounter, a lost animal, nothing more. Yet even as that thought formed, he heard the uneven scrape of paws behind him, soft but persistent, a sound that refused to let the moment end. Max followed at a distance of only a few steps now, close enough that Ethan could hear his breathing, short and ragged, each exhale puffing white into the cold air before vanishing. The puppy's gait had changed since they first met, no longer curious or tentative, but driven, as if every step cost him something he could not afford to lose, his small body dipping with fatigue as thick snow clung to the fur along his belly and legs, slowing him further. Ethan slowed instinctively, irritation flickering through him before being replaced by something heavier, something closer to recognition. He had seen exhaustion like this before, not in animals, but in men who kept moving because stopping meant surrender. Ethan stopped and turned, really looking this time. Max stood there trembling, not from fear alone, but from hunger and cold, his young muscles tight beneath his coat, ribs faintly visible when he inhaled. Up close, the puppy's age was undeniable. Barely 3 months, paws oversized and clumsy, ears caught between floppy youth and the promise of strength to come. One ear leaned halfway upright, the other stubbornly folded, giving him an almost apologetic expression that did not match the intensity in his dark eyes. Those eyes never left Ethan's face. Not once. They watched him the way Ethan once watched extraction helicopters through smoke, counting seconds, praying something would arrive before it was too late. Ethan crouched, careful not to invade the puppy's space too quickly. The details sharpened as his gaze traced Max's body. Shallow scratches along the forelegs, red but clean, likely from underbrush. A bruise shadowing the left side of his ribcage where fur lay slightly flatter, as if pressed hard against something unyielding. And around his neck, the strip of fabric Ethan had noticed before, now fully visible. A torn piece of gray cloth, frayed and stiff with ice, tied loosely enough not to choke, but tight enough to stay. It was not rope. It was not string. It was clothing. The realization settled in Ethan's chest with a dull weight. Someone had been close enough to this dog to tear fabric. Someone who mattered. "All right," Ethan muttered under his breath, more habit than intention, as he straightened. He took several deliberate steps toward the cabin again, testing the boundary he felt tightening around him. This time, Max reacted instantly. A thin, broken whine tore from the puppy's throat, sharp enough to make Ethan halt mid-step. Max surged forward, panic overtaking caution, and for the first time he made physical contact, his small teeth catching the edge of Ethan's pant leg. It was not aggressive. It was not playful. It was desperate, the kind of gesture that came only when all other options were gone. Ethan froze. His body responded before his mind did, muscles locking, breath steadying as if he were back on a mission where sudden movement could cost lives. He looked down at the puppy clinging to his leg, feeling the faint tremor running through Max's jaw, and something inside him cracked open just enough to hurt. He had sworn he would never ignore that signal again, the moment when someone or something put their survival in his hands. Slowly, deliberately, he turned back toward Max, lowering himself until they were almost eye level. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly, the words landing heavier than he intended. Max released his grip, backed away a step, then turned and took several short, hurried paces in the opposite direction, stopping to look back, waiting. The direction Max chose was not random. Ethan recognized the line of trees, the subtle dip in the terrain. A ranger trail. Old, narrow, rarely used in winter except by those who knew the forest well or had no better choice. Ethan hesitated only a second before following. The trail swallowed them quickly, the trees closing in, branches overhead knitting together into a canopy that filtered the light into pale fragments. The snow here was thinner, wind-scoured in places, packed hard in others, and Ethan's eyes immediately picked up what Max seemed to know instinctively. The ground was disturbed, not heavily, not obviously, but wrong in ways that mattered. They moved slowly now, Max no longer pulling, but guiding in cautious increments, stopping often, sniffing the ground, then moving again, his nose tracing invisible lines through the cold air. Ethan noticed how the puppy's behavior shifted as they went deeper. His tail lowered, his ears flattening whenever the forest grew denser, his body angling closer to Ethan's leg as if drawing strength from proximity. This was no longer blind attachment. This was memory, fear layered over purpose. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, old instincts resurfacing with unsettling ease. The first sign came as a shallow groove in the snow, barely noticeable unless one knew how to look. It ran only a few feet before disappearing beneath a drift, but it was enough. Something heavy had been dragged here. Nearby, footprints appeared, uneven, staggered, one deeper than the other, suggesting injury or imbalance. Ethan knelt, brushing snow aside with a gloved hand. Beneath it, the ground was stained darker, the ice faintly tinged with brown-red where warmth had melted snow before freezing again. Blood? Not much, but blood all the same. Max stopped completely then, his small body shaking harder, a low, continuous whine vibrating through his chest as he circled the spot and pressed himself against Ethan's shin. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, a memory surfacing unbidden. Another trail, another forest, years ago, when he had followed signs like these and arrived minutes too late. He opened his eyes again, forcing himself back into the present. "You did good," he murmured, resting a steady hand on Max's back. The puppy leaned into the touch, drawing closer, his fear contained now only because Ethan was still there. Ethan checked his pack, fingers brushing over the familiar shapes of gear meant for emergencies he hoped never came. He hadn't called for help yet, not because he wouldn't, but because first he needed to know what lay ahead. The trail sloped downward into a shallow basin where the wind had eased, cold settling thick and unmoving. Here the forest felt different, quieter, heavier, as if sound itself hesitated to enter. Max slowed to a near crawl, his nose skimming the surface of the snow, breath hitching. He stopped beside a fallen tree, bark stripped away by time and weather, roots exposed like skeletal fingers. Max whimpered, then sat abruptly, refusing to move forward. Ethan's chest tightened. This was the edge of something. He stood still, scanning the area, every sense alert. He did not see a body, not yet, but he felt the presence of what had happened here, lingering like a bruise beneath the landscape. Ethan straightened, making a decision he knew would carry consequences beyond the forest. He reached into his jacket and activated his locator beacon, setting it to standby, not transmitting yet, but ready. He glanced down at Max, meeting the puppy's gaze. "We're not turning back," he said, more to himself than to the dog. Max's ears lifted slightly, hope flickering through fear, and he rose to his feet, stepping forward just enough to show the way without forcing it. Together they moved on, deeper into the trees, the trail narrowing further, the forest closing around them, as if sealing off the world behind. Ethan Walker, who had spent years avoiding unanswered calls for help, stepped fully into this one, guided by a creature too small to speak, yet carrying a truth too urgent to ignore. The forest grew heavier as daylight thinned, snow settling into a gray hush beneath fallen pines, where cold gathered in low places and the air felt pressed flat, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Ethan moved slowly now, no longer testing the trail but committing to it, his boots sinking less as the snow hardened near the ravine, his posture shifting into the controlled stillness that once preceded every breach and extraction, the kind of readiness he had hoped to leave behind with his uniform. Mac stayed just ahead of him, no longer pulling or circling, but guiding in short, deliberate bursts, his small body low, head forward, dark eyes flicking back every few steps to confirm Ethan was still there. And it struck Ethan then how young the dog truly was, barely 3 months old, paws oversized and clumsy, coat thick but uneven where puppy fur met the first promise of adult strength, one ear half standing while the other folded stubbornly, giving him a look of constant apology that clashed with the quiet resolve in his gaze. The signs along the trail sharpened with every yard, footprints layered over one another without rhythm, one boot pressing deeper than the other, as if its owner had leaned hard to compensate for pain, shallow slips where balance had been lost and recovered too late, and between them all, a faint disturbed line in the snow where something heavy had been dragged only a short distance before collapsing. Ethan knelt once, brushing away powder to reveal darker ice beneath, stained faintly brown where blood had melted and refrozen, and the sight sent a familiar, unwelcome tightening through his chest, because blood like this did not belong to accidents. Not here. Not with marks like those. They reached the ravine quietly, the trail dipping into a shallow hollow where the wind no longer reached. Cold pooling thick and unmoving, and Max stopped abruptly, his entire body stiffening, tail tucked tight, ears pinned flat against his skull. Ethan felt it too, the unmistakable sense of arrival, the way places that held violence seemed to absorb sound and return it. Altered, and he followed Max's line of sight until he saw it, not all at once, but in fragments that assembled themselves with cruel patience. The edge of a jacket sleeve crusted with ice beneath the snow, a gloved hand curled awkwardly near a stone, and then the stillness that did not belong to rest. Ethan dropped to one knee beside her, every movement careful, deliberate, his gloved hand sweeping snow from her face without jarring her neck, and what he found there tightened something deep in him. The woman was young, early 30s at most, her build slender but resilient, the kind shaped by long days outdoors rather than softness. Shoulders narrow yet defined beneath torn layers, her skin pale to translucence where cold had drained it, lips faintly blue, breath barely visible as it escaped in shallow, irregular puffs, and her hair, dark brown, straight and long, was tangled with ice where a shallow cut near her temple had bled and stopped, leaving a thin, rust-colored line that spoke of impact without mercy. Even unconscious, there was resolve in her features, a firmness to her jaw that suggested stubbornness rather than fear, and Ethan noticed the details that confirmed it. Winter boots, scuffed and damp but high quality, meant for distance rather than fashion. Thermal layers beneath a weatherproof jacket torn at the sleeve. And nearby, half buried in snow, a camera with its lens cracked, strap twisted tightly around her wrist as if she had refused to let go even when dragged. She was a nature photographer, he realized, not a tourist, not careless, but someone who trusted preparation and experience until something beyond either intervened. Max pressed close, trembling violently now, his small body shaking not just from cold, but from recognition, his nose touching her sleeve, a thin, broken sound escaping him that was neither bark nor whine, but something rawer. And when Ethan found her pulse, faint, uneven, but present, he released a breath he had not realized he was holding, because survival was still possible, barely, and barely was enough to act on. He moved with quiet efficiency, pulling his thermal blanket free, insulating her from the frozen ground, checking her airway, assessing the angle of her limbs without shifting her spine, the discipline of his past overriding the weight of memory, clawing at the edges of his focus. As he worked, Ethan spoke softly, anchoring her to sound, to presence, introducing himself as if names still mattered at the edge of consciousness. And for a moment they did, because her eyelids fluttered, her breath hitched painfully, and her lips parted just enough to release a whisper that scraped raw against the cold air. "Emily?" Followed by a pause so long Ethan feared she had gone again, and then, barely audible, "I'm sorry." Max reacted instantly, tail thumping weakly against the snow, his fear pierced by recognition, his body easing closer as if that single word had tethered her to him. Ethan leaned in, steadying her head, telling her she was not alone, that she needed to stay with him. And in that narrow window before she slipped back into unconsciousness, she gave him fragments rather than a story. Voices behind her, low and impatient, hands rough and unyielding, a blow that knocked the world sideways, the sound of her camera shattering, the cold biting through everything, and then being dragged, branches scraping skin and fabric alike. And when she fell silent again, the bruising along her wrists and forearms told him what her voice could not. Fingers had bitten too deep, not in panic, but in control. Ethan scanned the ravine, mapping angles and cover automatically, the forest no longer neutral but charged, and reached for his radio, calling in coordinates with a steadiness that surprised him, reporting a critically hypothermic female, possible assault, requesting immediate medical extraction, acknowledging the dispatcher's warning about worsening weather without hesitation, because he could already feel the pressure shift in the air. While he waited, he kept Emily warm, adjusted the blanket when her breathing faltered, spoke quietly to Max whenever the puppy's panic threatened to spiral, and noticed again the torn strip of gray fabric around Max's neck, now matching the frayed lining of Emily's sleeve where the tear had begun, the final confirmation of what the dog had done. Stayed when leaving would have meant safety, and left only when staying would have meant death. As the light thinned further and the ravine sank into shadow, Ethan adjusted his position to block the wind, preparing for the possibility that rescue might not arrive before nightfall. And in that moment he accepted with quiet clarity that this discovery was no longer just about survival. It was about responsibility. And whatever waited beyond this frozen hollow, questions, danger, consequences, he would meet it head-on, because turning away now would cost more than staying ever could. Snow returned without warning, thick and relentless, swallowing sound and distance alike, the forest retreating into a white blindness where time slowed and survival narrowed to breath, heat, and vigilance. Ethan realized the helicopter would not come long before the radio confirmed it, the signal breaking through static just long enough to deliver what he already felt in his bones, that the storm had closed the sky and the rescue team was pinned miles away by fallen trees and drifting roads, and he accepted the reality without anger, only a tightening focus, because there were nights you endured and nights you lost people, and this would be decided by which kind of man he chose to be before dawn. He moved with purpose, selecting a slight rise near the ravine that broke the wind, anchoring a tarp between two young pines, reinforcing it with fallen branches and packed snow, shaping a shelter that would not be warm but might be survivable. His movements economical, practiced, stripped of hesitation, while Max stayed close to Emily's side, the puppy's small body pressed against her ribs. His breathing shallow but steady, as if he understood that leaving even an inch of space would invite the cold to take it. Emily's condition wavered as the temperature dropped, her breath slowing, her skin cooling despite insulation. And Ethan worked constantly, cycling warmth from his own body into hers, adjusting layers, checking pulse and pupils, forcing himself to stay alert even as fatigue crept in like a physical weight. Her face in the dim light looked younger now, stripped of the sharpness fear had carved into it earlier, freckles visible across her nose, lashes clumped with frost, her dark hair loosened from its frozen snare and falling across her cheek, and Ethan caught himself studying those details not out of curiosity, but necessity, because noticing change was the difference between life and silence. The storm intensified after nightfall, wind driving snow sideways in dense sheets that rattled the tarp and erased all sense of direction. And Ethan rationed movement carefully, knowing sweat would kill as surely as cold if he let it, forcing himself into cycles of stillness and action, listening to the forest through the storm for sounds that did not belong, because danger did not always announce itself politely. Max lifted his head often, ears twitching, eyes reflecting firelight with an alertness far beyond his age, his young body thin but resilient, coat thickening unevenly in patches of black and tan, paws oversized and clumsy, yet planted with surprising resolve. And Ethan understood that this dog was no longer just following instinct, but memory, guarding something he had already nearly lost once. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness as the hours crawled past, her voice weak and fragmented when it surfaced. But the things she said carried weight, pieces of truth slipping free when pain loosened her grip on restraint. And Ethan stayed close, answering when she spoke, grounding her with presence rather than words, until at one point her hand twitched beneath the blanket and her fingers curled weakly into Max's fur, and the dog responded instantly, pressing closer, releasing a soft, broken whine that sounded like both relief and apology. Her lips moved, breath catching painfully, and this time her words held together long enough to form a story. She spoke of the trail before the storm, of light fading faster than expected, of stopping to photograph tracks she thought belonged to deer, of realizing too late they were not alone, and as her voice strengthened briefly, the images sharpened. Two men stepping from behind the trees, faces half-covered, movements careless and practiced, the smell of alcohol and wet wool, one of them grabbing her camera, the other her arm. And when she struggled, Max had lunged without hesitation, teeth sinking into flesh, a small body colliding with a much larger one in a desperate, fearless act that bought her seconds but cost him dearly. She described the kick that sent him flying, the sound he made when he hit the snow, the certainty that followed, sharp and final, that he had been killed for trying to protect her. Ethan listened without interruption, jaw tight, hands steady, because rage had no place here, only memory and resolve. And Emily's voice broke as she spoke of crawling, of calling for Max through the dark, of the men dragging her farther into the ravine and leaving her when she stopped responding. And then of hearing movement hours later, soft and uneven, and opening her eyes to find Max pressed against her side, limping, bleeding, alive. She smiled faintly, even as pain twisted her features, explaining how he had curled against her through the night, how she had woken again and again to the feel of his breath and warmth. How he had shifted whenever she shivered, refusing to sleep deeply. And when dawn came pale and weak through the trees, he had stood, hesitated only once, and then run, disappearing along the ranger trail he somehow knew would lead to people. The story drained her, and she slipped back into shallow sleep, but its weight remained, settling into Ethan with quiet force, because he had known courage in men trained for it, had expected it from them. But this was something else entirely, instinct sharpened into loyalty by love rather than command. And he looked at Max differently after that, not as a puppy who had survived something terrible, but as a being who had chosen again and again to stay when leaving would have been easier. The dog met his gaze briefly, dark eyes steady, then returned his attention to Emily, as if the matter required no further explanation. Hours stretched thin as the storm raged on, the fire shrinking and growing as Ethan managed it carefully, his own exhaustion clawing at him in waves he refused to indulge, because this was not a night that allowed sleep, not for him, not for anyone who wanted to see morning, and he used every technique he had learned to stay awake: cold water on his face, movement in controlled bursts, mental checklists repeated until they became rhythm. The radio crackled once with an update that brought little comfort. Roads still blocked, conditions worsening, earliest approach uncertain. And Ethan acknowledged, already planning contingencies he hoped he would not need. Just before dawn, when the storm finally began to loosen its grip, the wind easing into something like silence, Emily stirred again, her breathing stronger now, pulse steadier beneath his fingers, and Ethan allowed himself a single, measured breath of relief, because survival was no longer theoretical. It was happening, slowly, stubbornly, one heartbeat at a time. Max lifted his head, ears pricking, sensing the change before Ethan did, tail giving a small, exhausted wag, and when first light filtered weakly through the trees, revealing a forest reshaped by snow and night, Ethan knew they had crossed the hardest threshold, not into safety yet, but into possibility. He did not sleep when the sky lightened, did not relax when the storm retreated, because some nights followed you long after they ended, and this one would leave marks none of them could see. But as he adjusted the shelter, checked Emily once more, and watched Max settle back against her side with the quiet determination of a sentry who had earned rest but refused to take it fully, Ethan accepted a truth he could no longer avoid, that whatever waited beyond this forest, whatever reckoning came with daylight, he was already bound to both of them, not by duty or obligation, but by having chosen in the deepest part of the night to stay. Morning arrived slowly, pale and fragile, the storm retreating into the upper branches, while light seeped through the forest like a cautious promise, revealing tracks, scars, and the quiet proof that the night had been survived. The rescue team reached the ravine just after sunrise, their movements careful but efficient, orange jackets cutting through the white like signals of certainty. And Ethan stepped back for the first time since darkness fell, his body protesting the release of tension he had denied it for hours. The lead medic, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a frost-reddened face and calm gray eyes shaped by long winters, knelt beside Emily and spoke her name firmly, checking vitals, administering warmed fluids, and nodding once when her breathing steadied, while another rescuer carefully lifted her onto a stretcher, her face drawn but alive, lashes fluttering, as if she sensed safety even before she could name it. Max tried to follow immediately, small body trembling with urgency, paws slipping in the snow as he whined softly, and Ethan caught him gently, holding him close against his chest, murmuring reassurance not just for the dog, but for himself, because letting go now would mean admitting how deeply the night had bound them. Emily regained fuller consciousness during the evacuation, her eyes focusing with effort. The pain in them softened by relief when she saw Max pressed against Ethan's jacket. And though she could not speak much, her fingers lifted weakly in a gesture that was half blessing, half goodbye, trusting rather than fearful. And Ethan met her gaze with a promise he did not say aloud. At the hospital hours later, warmth and light replaced snow and shadow, doctors confirming she had passed the most dangerous threshold, hypothermia receding, injuries painful but survivable, the deeper wounds destined for time rather than surgery. And Ethan stood apart in the hallway, hands clasped behind his back, posture rigid out of habit, listening to words like stable and recovery with a gratitude that sat heavy in his chest, unfamiliar and almost uncomfortable. Because of her injuries and the psychological weight of what she had endured, Emily could not care for Max in the weeks that followed, and it was she who suggested the arrangement before anyone else could, her voice still weak but her resolve intact, asking Ethan to take the puppy with him, just for a while, until she could stand without shaking, sleep without waking in fear. Ethan hesitated, not because he did not want to, but because wanting something again felt dangerous. Yet when he looked down at Max, 3 months old, black and tan coat thickening with health, one ear now standing more often than not, eyes still too serious for a puppy, he understood that some responsibilities were not chosen, but recognized, and he agreed with a nod that carried more weight than words. Life at the cabin changed in ways Ethan did not anticipate. The silence reshaped rather than broken. Mornings beginning earlier because Max demanded them with clumsy enthusiasm, tail thumping against wooden floors, paws skidding as he learned the boundaries of a space that was no longer just shelter but home. Ethan fed him carefully, monitored his healing scrapes, taught him simple routines not as commands but as structure, and in return, Max followed him everywhere, not out of fear now, but attachment, settling near his boots when he worked, sleeping pressed against the cabin door at night as if standing guard, and Ethan found himself speaking more than he had in years, narrating small tasks aloud, his voice unused but steady, filling spaces he had once protected fiercely. In the weeks that followed, Ethan drove Max to the hospital regularly, the puppy riding in the passenger seat bundled in blankets, nose pressed to the window as the world widened beyond trees. And Emily's recovery unfolded in stages, her strength returning slowly, her appearance changing from fragility to quiet resilience. She was tall and lean, with a photographer's posture shaped by patience and observation. Dark hair now cut shorter for ease, skin still pale but warming with life, and her eyes, sharp, thoughtful, deeply expressive, softened every time Max barreled toward her with joyful abandon, the reunion never less than emotional, because each meeting reaffirmed survival not as an abstract idea, but as something tangible and warm. Ethan and Emily spoke little at first, conversation cautious, respectful of unhealed spaces. But familiarity grew in silence rather than words, shared glances when Max misbehaved, quiet smiles when he fell asleep mid-play. And Ethan noticed how Emily watched the forest outside the hospital windows, not with fear, but longing, the same longing that had once drawn her into danger and would now, he suspected, draw her back with different intent. She spoke eventually of returning to photography, not immediately, not recklessly, but deliberately, of reclaiming the wild places not as sites of trauma, but of meaning. And Ethan listened without judgment, recognizing the same need in himself, the refusal to let one night define an entire life. As winter loosened its grip, snow retreating inch by inch, Emily was discharged, her recovery declared complete, not because she was unchanged, but because she was ready to move forward. And she visited the cabin for the first time on a clear morning when light filtered cleanly through bare branches, the space modest and worn but sturdy, carrying Ethan's careful order and newly scattered signs of Max's presence. She walked slowly at first, then more confidently, touching the doorframe, the table, the window that faced the forest, and when she stepped outside, Max ran ahead, stopping only to look back, waiting, always waiting. And Emily laughed, a sound still unfamiliar but real. They returned to the forest together weeks later, not to the ravine, not to the place where fear had taken hold, but to a ridge overlooking the trees. Emily lifting her camera with steady hands, Ethan standing beside her not as protector, but companion. Max between them, older now, stronger, his movement sure, and the forest felt different, not softened, not tamed, but witnessed. And Emily captured images that spoke not of danger, but endurance, of winter giving way to new paths. And Ethan realized he no longer felt like a man hiding from the world, but one living within it again. 3 lives that had nearly been lost to snow and silence found their rhythm in shared mornings, shared roads, shared purpose. And when spring finally arrived, melting the last stubborn drifts, new tracks appeared along the forest floor, human and canine together, steady, deliberate, no longer wandering, and the cabin that once stood as a refuge for one became a home for 3. The winter that had tested them all receding into memory, leaving behind not emptiness, but connection. This story is not just about a former seal, a wounded woman, or a brave German Shepherd puppy. It is about what happens when someone chooses not to walk away. In everyday life, we are surrounded by quiet calls for help, sometimes obvious, often silent. A struggling friend, a stranger who feels invisible, a moment when doing nothing would be easier than doing what is right. Like Ethan, like Emily, like Max, we are all tested not by grand heroics, but by small decisions made in the cold, to stay, to listen, to care, to act. Max was small, injured, afraid, yet he refused to give up on the one he loved. Ethan believed he was done saving anyone until life asked him to stay awake one more night. Emily thought she was alone until loyalty found her in the dark. And maybe that's the lesson. You don't need to be strong to change a life. You just need to stay when others leave. If this story moved you, reminded you of someone, or gave you hope in difficult times, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from or what this story meant to you. We read every one. And if you believe in stories about courage, loyalty, second chances, and the quiet strength of the human heart, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. Sometimes the smallest footprints in the snow lead us back to what matters most.